She was 36, 14 weeks unpaid, and standing in the October rain when Edmund Crowther called her only a stitcher and shut the office door. The clerks behind the glass laughed. She had no husband. For Thomas was 2 years buried. No savings, no lease, no name stamped on a single strap she had built in 11 years at his benches. What she had was a worn brass trace buckle, rubbed bright along one edge, that had ridden on her dead husband's cart and now rode in her apron pocket. Instead of the £9 he owed her, Crowther signed over a failed harness shop called Buckle Yard with slipped slates, a block drain, and rent already behind. He told his foreman the place would bury her by spring. But what Edmund Crowther did not know was that above the old stitching room, lined up with an iron ring set into the floor, ran a scarred oak beam, and what that beam was for would not only change what Sarah's work was worth, it would change whose harness the army trusted. If a man has ever put his name on your work, say so in the comments. This story is for you. Sarah Gough had learned leather the way a surgeon learns the body, by studying the exact places where it failed. In October of 1889, she was one of 19 women who stitched for Crowther & Sons, a saddlery and harness house that filled half a street near the tannery end of Walsall and smelled of oak bark, tallow, and horses. Walsall made leather the way other towns made nails or glass. And Crowther & Sons sat in the middle of that trade like a well-fed cat, supplying merchants, omnibus stables, and now and then a contractor with government connections. Sarah sat at the far end of the stitching room, at the bench nearest the window, because the returns came to her. A return was a piece that had failed on the road and come back with a carter's complaint pinned to it. That morning it was an omnibus trace. The long strap that carries the pull of the horse back to the vehicle, and it had opened at the buckle turn, the place where the leather folds back around the metal and takes the worst of the strain. She began with her hands and her ears. She flexed the strap slowly beside her ear and listened. Sound leather moves quietly. Leather that is dying makes a small dry noise, faint as seeds shifting in a paper packet, as the fibers let go one at a time. This trace made that noise at the fold and nowhere else. She followed the tear with her thumbnail and found it ran along the stitch holes, hole to hole, the way a stamp tears along its row of little cuts. Whoever had made the strap had pricked the holes too close together at the one place it could least afford them, and had folded the turn short and steep instead of easing it around the metal. She cut back to sound leather, shaped a new turn with a gradual slope, skived the end thin so the thickness fell away by degrees instead of stopping at a step, and set her new holes wider, well away from the old wounded line. Then she stitched it with waxed linen thread she had rolled herself, 2 rows, every stitch pulled to the same tightness. The repair was ugly, and it would hold a ton of omnibus on a wet hill with 60 people aboard. A girl named Nell Cartwright, 19, stood at the hardware bench across the room, polishing buckles, which was all Crowther would let her do, although her father was a Loriner. She watched Sarah work the way some people watch a card trick. "How did you know where it would tear?" Nell said. "It told me," Sarah said. "You only have to listen before it breaks instead of after." In her apron pocket, Sarah carried a brass trace buckle, worn bright on one bearing edge and dull everywhere else. It had come off the cart her husband Thomas drove for 11 years, hauling coal and timber, until the dust settled in his lungs and finished him at 39. His horse, a patient brown gelding called Duke, had been sold afterward to a coal merchant over in Wednesbury, and what became of him there Sarah never learned. The buckle was worth less than 6pence. She kept it because the bright worn edge showed exactly where the load had ridden every time the horse leaned into the collar. Thomas had put it into her hand the winter before he died, after she mended his near-side trace at the kitchen table. And he said one thing about it that she kept. "Read the wear before you trust the strap," he said. He was the only man who had ever asked her opinion of leather before asking her to sew it. When the omnibus trace was finished, the foreman, John Marsh, 47, came down the room, took it without a word, and carried it to the front office, where the order card received the stamp of Crowther and Sons, maker. Sarah's name went nowhere. Her pay for the piece was 1 shilling and 2 pence. The rate for stitching a repair, the reading of the tier, the recut, the moved hole line, the part that decided whether the strap lived or died on the road, carried no rate at all, because as far as the firm's books were concerned, it had never happened. 10 days later, Joseph Baines, 44, foreman of the Bridgeman Street omnibus and cart stable, stopped her in the lane outside the works. He was a square man who had known Thomas, and he wasted no words on the weather. "That trace you did," he said. "It went up Church Hill in the wet on Tuesday with a full load, and it went again Thursday. I have lost 2 newer straps on that route this month, both tore at the buckle. Yours held. It will keep holding," Sarah said. "Whose name is on the card?" he said. It was not really a question. He touched his cap and walked on. That was October. In November, Mr. Crowther began preparing the batch that would put Sarah out of his works, and though neither of them knew it yet, out of his reach. A merchant house in Birmingham had let it be known that it was looking for harness makers fit to supply military transport contractors. Wagon harness for army stores, steady work at steady prices. Crowther wanted it the way some men want a title. He ordered a showcase batch of wagon harness, 12 sets, everything glossy, everything stamped, everything finished like drawing room furniture. To make the margins sing, he made 2 quiet choices. He had his cutters take the traces, the most heavily loaded straps in the harness, out of belly and flank leather that looked clean and even but runs loose and stretchy, instead of the firm back leather that costs more and looks no better to a buyer's eye. And he ordered the stitching brought up to 12 holes to the inch around the buckle turns, because fine, close stitching looks expensive, where 8 to the inch would have carried the load better and left more living leather between the holes. Sarah was given the turns to stitch. She flexed the first trace beside her ear, out of habit, and heard the seeds. On the bench, under a raking light, she bent the turn the way a horse would bend it, leaning hard into a start on cold ground, and watched a faint crescent-shaped shadow rise in the grain just past the fold. A strain mark, the leather's way of showing where it is asked for more than it has. She had seen that crescent 100 times on returns that had already failed. She had never before seen it on work that had not yet left the building. She took the trace to Marsh and asked for the inspection card. Someone had to sign the line that said the work was sound. She would not sign, and she said why. Wrong leather in the traces, turns folded too steep, holes pricked too close at the point of highest strain. She recommended recutting the 6 most exposed straps from back leather and easing the turns. It would cost perhaps £3 in material and a week in time. Marsh carried the message upstairs. The answer came back down in the shape of Mr. Crowther himself. Watch chain first. He was a broad man of 49 with mutton chop whiskers trimmed like hedges, and he had a habit, when customers were present, of never touching unfinished leather, as though the condition might be catching. "The card wants a signature, not an opinion," he said. "Then it can have someone else's," Sarah said. He looked at her the way a man looks at a chair that has creaked under him, and he had a junior clerk sign the card instead. Only much later did Sarah understand the rest of it. Her repair pattern, the gradual turn and the reinforcement shape, had already been copied into the batch, because word had gone around that her turns did not come back, but it had been copied by eye and at speed, without the wider hole spacing, without the note on which part of the hide to use. The skin of her method, with the bones taken out. The demonstration was held in the yard at Bridgeman Street on a gray Saturday, so the Birmingham merchant could see the harness on real horses. 2 of the 12 sets were buckled onto a pair of heavy geldings and put to a loaded coal wagon. The merchant, a narrow man in a good coat, stood under the eaves out of the drizzle. Crowther talked the whole time, about finish, about his grandfather, about the stamp. The wagon started, stopped, and started again on command. The ordinary test of harness under a jerking load. On the third start, the near trace gave a sound like a slow yawn and began to open at the buckle turn. The wagon slewed sideways, a wheel caught the gutter stone, and for 4 or 5 bad seconds, 2 tons of coal wanted to go where the horses were not going. Baines's men were at the horses' heads at once, an older hand named Cope, 50, hanging his whole weight off the near bridle, and the thing came to rest with nothing broken but the trace and the morning. No one was hurt. Everyone had seen. Crowther crossed the yard while the trace still hung by its lining and said, loudly enough for the merchant, that this was what came of careless stitching and that the woman responsible would answer for it. Sarah heard that from 6 feet away, because she had been sent along to adjust the fit if anyone asked. She walked to the wagon, got a nod from Cope, and opened the failed turn flat against the tailboard with her pocket knife. The tear ran cleanly from stitch hole to stitch hole, a perforated line like a ticket torn from a book, through leather that had stretched pale where sound leather would have held its color. Her stitches were still in their places. The thread had not broken. The leather between the holes had. "The stitching is mine," she said. "The stitching is the only part of this that held. The leather is flank, the turn is short, and the holes are set 12 to the inch at the one place the strap most needed to be left alone. I said so before the card was signed." The merchant looked from the strap to Crowther with the beginnings of arithmetic in his face. Crowther did not raise his voice. He lifted her out of the story like a man changing his coat. "You will not lecture this yard on leather," he said. "You are a stitcher. You are only a stitcher. And from this morning you are not even that, because you are finished at my works." The 14 weeks came about like this. Pieceworkers were paid a fortnight behind, and Sarah was also owed for a long tail of repairs, repriced downward as plain stitching, and for 2 disputed summer batches, never settled. Taken together, it made 14 weeks of proper pay, £9 and some shillings by her own careful count, kept in pencil on the back pages of her rent book. When she asked for it at the office window on the Monday, the clerk found that the firm's books showed otherwise. The firm's books were leather-bound and stamped. Her rent book was not. A solicitor's clerk named Henry Albert, 26, earnest and cheap, wrote 2 letters for her at a shilling the pair. The letters produced a meeting, and the meeting produced an offer, made across a table in the back room of the Green Dragon, with 2 trade witnesses present, a saddler named Foss and an ironmonger named Kite, both of whom owed Crowther money and neither of whom would meet her eye. The offer was this: full and final settlement of all claims, in the form of the leasehold and remaining contents of Buckle Yard Harness Rooms, a small subcontract shop off Marsh Lane, whose last tenant had failed in the spring. Crowther had bought the lease and stock for next to nothing, stripped the best hides and fittings out for his own works, and been carrying the rest ever since. The lease had 11 years to run at £16 a year. There were arrears of £7. The roof wanted money. The tools were damaged, and a rent review was due in the spring. He listed the faults himself, comfortably. Henry Albert leaned close and told her plainly that she could press for the cash and might see it in a year, or might see Crowther's lawyers instead, and that no saddler in Walsall would give her bench room against Crowther's word in the meantime. Grace Mullins, 41, an edge finisher at the works who kept the only honest arithmetic in the women's room and fed 2 children on it, went through the paper with her the night before. It was Grace who noticed that the schedule of contents listed the movable goods and said nothing either way about what was fastened down. So Sarah asked for one addition before she signed. All articles fixed to the fabric of the building: beams, racks, benches fast to the walls, pulley blocks, rings, and floor irons, to pass with the premises. Crowther laughed for the first time that day. He said she was welcome to the cobwebs and the rot, and he had the clause written in. Albert copied the agreement out twice in a round clerk's hand. All 4 names went onto both, and 1 copy went into her basket under a cloth. She was given 3 keys on a string, one of which, it turned out, fitted nothing anyone could ever find. The whole business took under 40 minutes, and at the end of it Crowther paid for the room's use, tuppence, out of loose silver, and told the landlord to bring the lady whatever she liked, and left without waiting to hear what that might be. She walked to Buckleyard the same afternoon in cold rain, through a brick archway streaked white with pigeon lime, into a narrow cobbled court with soot-dark buildings on 3 sides of her. The sign over the double doors had once said, "Harness rooms in gold." The gold was mostly gone. The doors were swollen with wet, and she had to set her shoulder to the left one and shove twice before it gave. She went through the place the next morning with a candle lantern and a piece of chalk, writing what she found on the back of the settlement copy. The cutting room on the ground floor held a long central bench, scarred gray, dry as biscuit, but sound underneath when she bored it with an awl. The tall racks along the wall, built for hanging sides of leather, had been stripped to the frames. In the stitching room above, the good north light still came through the tall windows where the glass survived. And the saddler's clams, the wooden jaws that hold work, while both hands stitch, stood in a row with their springs gone slack and one jaw split. The hardware bench had 9 drawers. 7 were rusted shut. 1 held 4 dozen buckles of which no 2 matched, and 1 held a mouse's nest and the mouse. The roof over the far corner had a gap she could put her fist through, and the rain had been coming in long enough to turn the boards below it black. The yard drain was blocked with leaves, road grit, and 1 dead starling. So the whole court held a sheet of standing water. All of it was bad, and none of it was mysterious. The building had failed the way a neglected building fails, by inches, with nobody watching. 2 things did not fit the ordinary story of ruin. The first was behind the stripped rack in the rear storage room, fallen down in the gap against the wall. A single trace. Old, thin, plain as a plank. Its surface dark, from years of careful dressing, and its edges worn round by use. It was lighter than anything Crowther sold. But when she flexed it beside her ear, slowly, it made no sound at all. The turn at its buckle end was closed and tight after what must have been years of pulling. She stood in the cold with that thin, ugly strap in both hands and could not explain it. Her best guess was age itself. Leather from the old slow oak bark pits, tanned for a year or more the old way, must simply have been better than what the trade bought now. It was a reasonable guess. It was also wrong, and it would cost her before she learned better. The second thing was up in the stitching room. A heavy oak roof beam ran across the ceiling there, and near its middle hung an iron eye. Forged, not cast, with the wood around it polished by rope. Along one face of the beam ran a row of small notches, cut deliberately, evenly spaced. 7 of them, and directly below, set into the floor and packed with years of dirt, was an iron ring, a floor anchor, in a straight plumb line under the eye. Ring, eye, and notches lined up like a sum waiting to be done. She decided the beam had been used to hoist hides up to the oiling loft, which was the sensible answer, except that the loft door was at the other end of the room entirely. So hold on to the question Sarah could not answer that morning, because the whole story turns on it. Why would Edmund Crowther, a man who charged his own workers for broken needles, sign away a building with forged iron, still bolted into its bones, unless he was certain that iron was rubbish? The answer hung over the stitching room the whole time, and Sarah walked under it for 2 months before she saw it. She made her list in chalk on the cutting bench, in order of survival. Make 1 room dry. Recover 1 bench. Sharpen what blades remained. Clear the drain. Sill. Make he. In. My. Then go and find paid work. Because everything else was vanity until money came through the arch. Nell Cartwright came through that arch on the 3rd morning, hatless, with her father's temper in her chin. Crowther had turned her out too, a week after Sarah, for asking Marsh 1 question too many. She said she wanted work. Sarah told her the truth, that there was 7 shillings for 1 week, and after that, she could not promise Tuesday. Nell said that was fine. Sarah said it was not fine, and sent for Grace. And Grace wrote out a plain agreement on a half-sheet, 1 week certain at 7 shillings, wages first charge on any money in, notice owed both ways. Nell signed it with a flourish she must have practiced. Grace signed underneath as witness, in the small, careful hand of a woman who had been cheated by handwriting before. The shop to the left of the yard belonged to a wheelwright called Amos Tranter, 66, who kept racing pigeons in a loft over his wood store and talked to them more than to people. He has almost nothing to do with this story, except that the clatter of his birds coming home at dusk became the sound by which Sarah learned to put the tools down each night, and that his ladder, borrowed over the wall, patched a roof he never once looked up at. Sarah sold her mother's mahogany veneered dresser that week for £1 6 shillings, spent it on second-hand slates, ridge mortar, 2 balls of best linen thread, and a jar of dressing, and said nothing more about the dresser to anyone. She and Nell hauled the slates up Tranter's ladder and laid them rough but tight. Grace unblocked the drain with a rake head lashed to a broom handle and timed the quart draining itself at 11 minutes, which pleased her more than she would admit. They chose the stitching room as the one dry room, reset the least broken clam with a new spring. Nell's father forged as a favor and sharpened the 3 surviving knives until they would slice a hanging strip of newspaper. Then Sarah put on her shawl, walked to Bridgeman Street, and asked Joseph Baines for paid work, in as few words as he favored. Baines took her through to the harness room, where the stable's walking wounded hung on pegs, and offered her 6 damaged cart harness sets at £2.10 for the lot, half on delivery, half after 3 weeks on the road. Every repaired strap to be marked with a maker's mark, measured before it went out, and measured again at 3 weeks, and if anything of hers opened on a route, the whole arrangement was finished, and he would say so to anyone who asked why. "That is fair," Sarah said. "It is more than fair," Baines said. "It is careful. I knew your husband. That buys you the door, missus, and nothing past it." The 6 sets taught the whole trade in miniature, because no 2 had died the same death. One trace had stretched at its adjustment holes until the tongue of the buckle sat sideways. One turn had cracked from dryness. One buckle tongue was rough from the forge and had sawed at its strap like a file under the leather where nobody looked. One rivet had been set proud and worked loose. One belly band was simply worn through at the girth and honest about it. Sarah cut back each fault to sound leather, matched each repair to its cause, moved hole lines away from wounds, eased the turns, and dressed the leather until it drank no more. She also began 2 habits that later carried more weight than she guessed. Each repaired component was struck with initials, hers or Nell's, small, near the buckle, where a stableman would find them, and each went into a ruled book Grace kept, with its measurements, its fault, its cure, and its maker, 1 line to a strap, dated. The first test of the book came fast. Sarah, checking Nell's bench, ran a thread over a buckle tongue Nell had passed, and felt it snag. Under a bright coat of polish, the inner edge was still rough. Nell had found the fault, run out of daylight, and polished over it, hoping it would do. Sarah did not raise her voice. She put the buckle in Nell's hand, took a scrap strap, worked it over that edge 50 times, and showed her the pale dust of cut fibers on the bench. "Polish is what a fault wears when it wants to leave the shop," she said. "Take it out, do it right, and write the correction in the book under your own initials. The mark is not a reward, girl. It is a signature on a promise." Nell filed the edge true, entered the correction, and slept badly, and was better for it. 3 weeks later, the 6 sets came back for inspection, crusted with January mud and honest sweat, and Sarah went over every strap with her rule, while Baines stood at her shoulder. Not one of her turns had opened. Not one measurement had moved past the small ink line she had set as its allowance. One belly band she had never touched had stretched half an inch, and she pointed it out herself, before Baines found it, and priced its replacement at cost. He looked at her a moment when she did that. He paid the balance, £1.5, and then did the thing she had hoped for, without asking. He ordered a complete new pair harness set for his best team, and he accepted her price of £11, which was the first price she had ever set in her life that paid for her eyes as well as her hands. Cutting, fitting, and inspection were written on the order as work, with money against each. Word of that order traveled. Within the fortnight, Walter Peake, 55, the leather factor she had bought from, grew suddenly awkward. Whole sides on credit were no longer possible for her. Cash terms only, he said, not meeting her eye. And perhaps she would do better with offcuts, which were more suited to repair work. Nobody said Crowther's name. Nobody needed to. Sarah paid cash. She bought one expensive side of oak bark harness back, £1.12, the finest leather she had ever owned, because she was still carrying her theory about the thin old trace. Old slow tanning, she believed, was the secret. And this side was tanned the old slow way. Grace worked the sums both ways that night and said them out loud. If the set was refused, they would be £3 short of the February rent with nothing coming in behind it. The set Sarah and Nell built was the best bench work either of them had ever done. Back leather in every trace, gradual turns, 8 holes to the inch, double rows, every component initialed and entered. In the yard, standing pull after standing pull, nothing moved. But a full pair harness needs collars, and new collars were beyond the budget, so Sarah bought a second-hand collar for 6 shillings, restuffed it herself by lamplight, and judged it close enough for the near horse. She had repaired collars. She had never made one fit. She did not yet know there was a difference. The road trial was a loaded run out the Birmingham road and back. For the first mile, the team went sweetly. On the long rise past the canal bridge, the near horse, a heavy bay called Boxer, began to shorten his stride. Then he tossed his head. Then, at the steepest pitch, he balked outright, legs planted, ears flat, a good, honest horse refusing for the first time in his working life. Baines stopped the trial there, on the hill, and had the collar off in the road. Under it, on the left shoulder, was a patch rubbed hot and angry, the size of a hand, where Sarah's restuffing had thrown the bearing surface out of true and set the whole pull grinding on one place. Nothing broke, Sarah said, and heard how it sounded as she said it. A harness that holds while it hurts the horse is a failed harness, Baines said. He cannot tell me where it pinches until it is already wrong. That is the whole of the job, missus. The strap is the half of it, you know. He withdrew the larger route order until she could prove her fitting. He was not unkind about it. He was not kind about it either. Sarah paid 7 shillings and 6pence for Boxer's treatment out of the rent money, and that evening she wrote the entry in the book herself, in ink, where every future page would sit on top of it. Set refused. Cause, collar fit. Maker, S. G. Grace said quietly that a written failure could be shown to anyone. Forever. So can a hidden one, Sarah said. The day it comes apart on a hill, if I polish over this. Then Buckleyard is Crowther's shop with a different name on the door, and I have been rained on all winter for nothing. It took her 2 days to swallow her pride and 1 hour to act on it. Eli Hargreaves, 61, had been the best collar maker on the north side of town until his eyes began to fail him. And now he restuffed second-hand collars for a dealer at 4pence apiece, holding the work at arm's length and an angle to catch what sight he had left. Sarah put the failed collar on his table and told him everything, including the part where it was her own doing. You stitchers think a collar is a cushion, Eli said. It is the foundation. Everything pulls through it. The trace, the turn, your fine stitching. All of it arrives at 2 shoulders. And if the collar sits wrong, the better your straps are, the more faithfully they deliver the hurt. He showed her, with his thumbs in the stuffing, where her wool had bridged and gone hard, how the shoulder angle threw the draft line low, why a bare inch of error at the throat became a raw patch in a mile. She offered him 12 shillings a week for 3 days' work, and the last word on every collar that left the shop. He asked who would thread needles for him. "Nell," she said. He grumbled that he would come and look at the place, which in Eli's language was, yes. He came, climbed the stairs, and stood a long time under the beam, his ruined eyes narrowed at the iron eye, the 7 notches, and the ring in the floor beneath. "Who told you this was a hoist?" he said. "Nobody. I guessed it. You guessed wrong. I served my boy's time in a shop in Wednesbury that had one of these. That is a proving beam. Tackle on the eye, strap made fast between beam and floor ring, and weight hung on, so much and then so much more. The notches are the stages. This shop tested its work before it sold it. Every strap that mattered went up there, and was made to answer." Sarah stood looking up at the beam she had walked under all winter, while several things fell into place like tumblers in a lock. She fetched the thin old trace, and the 2 broken Crowther straps Baines had let her take from the stable's junk box for nothing. And on the cutting bench, under the grime, she and Eli traced the faded painted letters she had taken for width markings, and found them keyed to purpose. T for traces on the deepest grooves, where only firm back leather had been cut. B, where the breeching had been laid out. G, for girths. The old shop had not just cut leather, it had sorted the hide by task, cut each part from the ground that suited it, proved the load-bearing work under the beam, and only then let it out the door. The thin trace had never been magic, and its tanning was only part of its story. It had been placed, shaped, stitched, and proved by a system, and the system was still here, bolted into the building Crowther had signed away laughing. They rebuilt the proving rig in 9 days. The beam itself Sarah bored and found sound. A second-hand block and tackle cost 9 shillings at the marine store. Nell's father lent 4 56-pound iron weights and sold them a 100-weight of scrap iron, weighed honest at the coal yard, sewn into canvas bags. Grace pinned a white-painted lath behind the test strap with pencil marks on it, so any stretch could be read by eye. Load went on by the half-hundredweight, stage by stage, each stage held while they watched and listened. Then they cut matched strips from different parts of the expensive side, all one width, and set about asking the leather questions. Sarah's first test strip failed, and it failed at her own knife work. She had ended the skeeve too abruptly, leaving a step in the thickness. And at the 5th stage, the strip began to give exactly at the step. Nell looked frightened. Sarah looked pleased, which confused the girl badly. "Better here than on a hill," Sarah said. "That is what the beam is for. It buys our mistakes, at a price we can pay." She recut the skeeve long and gradual, and ran the test again. The second strip, firm back leather, eased turn, 8 holes to the inch, went through every stage to more than 3 times a working pull, and the lath showed stretch you could barely lay a pencil line against. Then they hung a strip cut thick and handsome from the soft end of the side, folded steep, pricked 12 to the inch, and at the 6th stage it began, faint and dry. The sound of seeds, the holes reaching for one another. They took it down and opened it. And there was the crescent, the same mark Sarah had seen on the bench at Crowther's a year of trouble ago. So the thin old trace gave up its secret. And the secret was work. Sound ground in the hide, fiber running with the load. A turn that eased instead of broke. Holes that left the leather its strength. Proof under known weight before any horse ever felt it. And, Eli added, tapping the bench, a fit to the animal at the end of it. Or all the rest was cruelty in good condition. Grace wrote the whole sequence out fair on 1 page. Grade the hide, allot by task, measure the horse, cut with the fiber, ease and skive the turns, prick to spacing, stitch and reinforce, prove on the beam stage by stage. Fit to the team, record and sign. She nailed it to the inside of the cutting room door, where it stayed until the paint outlived everyone in this story. What Buckle Yard became that spring was the same small shop with its memory back. The racks were relettered by task, and leather went on to them by its ground. Back with back, shoulder with shoulder, belly kept honest for the work belly could do. Nell took over the hardware bench and tire, testing every tongue and ring against a gauge she filed from an old key, and rejected what failed without asking anyone's permission. Eli fitted every collar to the horse that would wear it, or to its measurements when the horse could not come. And Grace's book grew columns, maker, material, test stage, fitting notes, date, and wage, until a stranger could open it at any line and know who had done what, and what it had been paid. The corrected Baines set went out in March, with a collar Eli built to Boxer's own shoulders. The pair ran 3 hard routes: Church Hill in the wet, the Canal Rise, the Birmingham Road under full load, and came back cool and easy, with every measurement inside its ink line. Baines transferred the stable's repair work to Buckle Yard at standing rates. He also did one thing more without telling her. He showed Grace's book to a military stores contractor in Birmingham, a firm supplying transport equipment to the Army and hunting small subcontract capacity. The contractor's letter came in April. 1 sample wagon team harness, to be inspected and tried against the contractor's requirements, with evidence that the shop could deliver 12 trace and repair sets across 4 months behind it. The trial would be witnessed by Captain Arthur Vale, 42, an Army transport officer assigned to the contractor's inspections. The first price the contractor's agent proposed was smooth and short. Grace divided it by the hours. And what it meant was that the women of Buckle Yard would be stitching for nothing from Wednesday afternoon onward each week. Sarah wrote back declining the rate, itemizing her costs from the book, line by line, and naming the price that paid them. The agent, used to subcontractors who swallowed and signed, took 9 days to answer, and then accepted the higher sample rate against strict delivery terms. Then Crowther learned who else had been invited. And the weather changed. Walter Peake regretted that the sides she had ordered would be 9 days late, and that credit was, as she knew, not possible. A letter from Crowther and Sons told the contractor that the buckle-turn dimensions in use at Buckle Yard had been developed in the firm's employment, were the firm's property, and that her sample ought not to be received. And Crowther submitted his own bid for the same lot, priced well under hers, with a request that his sample be tested the same day, before the same witnesses. He wanted the comparison, sure of what polish and a stamp would do in front of an officer. Sarah had no patent, and no lawyer she could pay past the shilling kind. What she had was dated paper. Her rent book with its pencil pages. Grace's ruled book, every line signed. Baines's repair dates going back to October. The old bench letters at Buckle Yard, older than Crowther's claim by a generation. And the plain fact, which she set out in one short letter, that her sample's dimensions were taken from the contractor's own wagon team, measured in the contractor's own yard in May, and a man cannot own a pattern taken from horses he has never seen. Captain Vale's reply to both parties ran to 3 lines. Both samples would be received. Both would be subjected to identical inspection, load, and trial. Neither bidder was guaranteed anything. The last month was the hardest arithmetic of Sarah's life. Rent fell due before the sample money could possibly come. A collar factory across town offered Grace steady work at 11 shillings a week, and Grace, who had 2 children and no margin for loyalty, sat with the offer for a day. Sarah did not make a speech at her. She opened the accounts, all of them, and offered what the accounts could honestly carry: 8 shillings a week guaranteed. The balance entered in the book as owed, payable the day the contract paid. Grace looked at the columns for a long time, said, "You show me everything," which he never did, and stayed. Then Nell, testing hardware for the sample, found that a full batch of 24 buckle tongues, bought cheap in the squeeze, carried rough inner edges under their plating. Replacing them cost 11 shillings, and 4 days they did not have. Nobody outside the shop would ever have known. Sarah thought about that for as long as it takes to pick up a file, and they replaced every one and entered the reason. The sample was finished on a Thursday night in June. Plain, dark, dressed, proved on the beam through every stage, every component initialed, its record book tied to the crate with waxed thread. When it was done, the cash tin held £1 1 and 4 pence, and the rent was £5, due in 18 days. Sarah turned the key in the swollen door and went home past Martha Doyle's coffee stall, and Martha, 58, who had kept that corner through 3 trade slumps and outlived 2 husbands on it, let her have the last can of the night for nothing, on the grounds that she did not like the look of her. The inspection was held on a wet Tuesday in the contractor's yard, a wide brick court off the Birmingham Road, with a loaded wagon standing ready, and a test frame rigged at one end, beam, tackle, and weights. Everyone came. Crowther in his black frock coat and green waistcoat, with Marsh and 2 of his cutters. The contractor's agent, Baines, invited as a witness to dates. Peak the factor, standing carefully in the middle of the yard where he could be seen agreeing with whoever won. Stable men along the wall. And Captain Vale, dry under the eaves, with a notebook and a watch, and the expression of a man who had heard every story Leather could tell and believed the weights instead. Crowther's sample came out of its crate shining. Elaborate edgework, deep polish, the famous stamp struck proud on every strap. Beside it, Sarah's set looked like what it was. Plain, dark, and unornamented. Initials small by the buckles, its test record tied on with thread. Crowther looked at the 2 of them side by side and permitted himself one remark to the agent, in a voice pitched for the whole yard, that he had not known the army bought its harness by the pound of grease. There was laughter along the wall. Sarah heard it and let it lie. She had been laughed at in better yards by worse men. Crowther then made his formal objection: pattern theft, her dimensions his property, her sample inadmissible. Vale heard him out, took Sarah's dated books and Baines's confirmation of the October repairs, turned the pages without hurry while the rain ticked on the eaves, and closed them. "I am not here to weigh argument," he said. "I am here to weigh harness. Both samples go on the frame. Same stages, same weights, same trial. What holds, holds." Crowther's trace went up first, made fast between beam and floor ring. Weight went on by the half-hundredweight, stage by stage, the yard quiet enough to hear the rope creak. At the 4th stage, nothing. At the 5th, nothing a man could see. It was at the 6th stage that Sarah heard it, from 12 feet away, before anyone saw anything move. A faint, dry run of snaps, seed after seed after seed, from inside the glossy turn. She knew that sound the way Baines knew a lame step. Her hand came up without her deciding it. "Captain, stop the load." Vale's own hand was already rising, but the leather moved first. Along the buckle turn, under the polish, a pale line opened. Hole reaching to hole. Vale had the weight taken off, and the turn opened flat on the bench, and there it all was, laid out in daylight. The crescent strain line. The holes at 12 to the inch, joined into the beginning of a tier. The steep short turn, the soft ground of the hide gone stretched and pale under its shine. It was the omnibus trace again, the demonstration wagon again, the same failure in the same place for the same reasons, wearing its best coat. "The load is excessive," Crowther said. "No working harness meets such weight." "Then the other sample will fail it too," Vale said, and had Sarah's trace made fast to the same stage. It held. It held the 6th stage and the 7th, and the lath behind it showed a stretch inside the allowance written in her own record book, which Vale checked against the mark himself, twice. Flex inspection came next. And here the day put its thumb on Sarah. It was Nell who saw it. And Nell, who could have said nothing. One of the removable buckles on Sarah's breeching, worked back and forth under load, had begun to rub faintly at an edge. Nell looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the buckle, and then asked Vale's leave to speak. That fitting is beginning to rub. My record lists an inspected spare for every removable fitting on the set. I asked to change it, as the record provides. Vale looked at the listed spare, stamped and entered, and allowed the change, saying that a declared and recorded correction was the process working, and that he wished he saw more of it. The buckle was changed in 90 seconds with the tools on Nell's belt. Then the horses. Eli fitted Sarah's collars to the team, thumbs in at the shoulder, an inch let out at one throat, and the pair walked away sweet from the first step. Crowther's set, its broken trace replaced from his stock, was fitted for its own trial, and his collar rode askew on the near horse until it was adjusted twice on the yard by a stable man, in view of everyone. A small thing, and a loud one. Sarah's team took the loaded wagon out on the prescribed route, up the rise, under the bridge, back through the gate, and stood blowing gently while every measurement was taken and every measurement sat inside its line. Vale wrote for 4 minutes, which is a long time in a silent yard, and read the result out plainly. Buckle Yard, approved for a conditional subcontract, 12 wagon team trace and repair sets across 4 months. Every set subject to recorded proof and inspection. Further work depending on delivery. Crowther and Sons, sample rejected on structural failure. Free to submit again when its work could meet the same standard of evidence. Mistress Gough, Vale said, as the maker responsible, you will sign the schedule. She signed it Sarah Gough, maker. And nobody in that yard laughed. Crowther stood a moment looking at the frame, at the open turn on the bench with his stamp on it. He pulled on his gloves, finger by finger. He said nothing at all, to anyone, which from him was a kind of confession, and he walked out through the arch with Marsh a step behind, and Peake the factor was somehow already near Sarah's elbow, remarking that whole sides had, after all, always been available to established accounts. The 12 sets went out on schedule. The last crate signed for on the 3rd of July, 1890, and the money came in behind them the way water follows a cleared drain. Nobody grew rich on it. It paid wages, rent, materials, and a margin, which is all a shop is ever owed. By then, the court off Marsh Lane had a repainted sign, Gough Harness Works, Buckle Yard, and 6 names on the wage book that Grace closed every Friday at the bench, in ink, in front of everyone, with no deductions but the lawful ones. Sarah, Nell, Grace, Eli. A stitcher of 28 named Ada Pemberton, and a quiet girl of 17 called Ruth Small, who said perhaps 10 words a week and stitched like a chapel window. On the wall above the racks hung a board, where every maker's name stood beside the work that carried it. One morning a carrier delivered a harness for repair, an ordinary paid job from a haulage firm, and the strap wore the stamp of Crowther and Sons. Nell looked at Sarah with the question on her face. Sarah put the job in the book at the standard rate and gave the stamp no more comment than she gave the mud. The horse that wore it had not chosen its maker. That same week, Nell finished her first critical trace, from raw side to buckle, alone, and entered it, and asked for it to be proved. It went up on the beam and through every stage, and the lath barely moved. Sarah took from her apron a small new inspection stamp, cut with the letters NC, and put it in the girl's hand, and gave her the only sentence that had ever been given to her, with an object attached. Read the wear before you trust the strap, she said, and sign what you trust. Then she went up to the stitching room, and on a nail above the proving beam, where the 7 old notches showed in the oak, she hung Thomas's worn brass buckle, bright edge outward, where every strap that went up under weight would answer to it. Below in the yard, a team was coming in through the arch for fitting, big feet ringing on the cleared cobbles, and there was work in the book for a month ahead. Sarah Gough had been 36, 14 weeks unpaid. And wet through in the rain, the day a man settled a £9 debt with a ruin he trusted to finish her. Of everything she was ever paid in her life, before or since, that ruin turned out to be the payment that earned the most, and she collected on it every working morning, at the bench, in her own name.